Hello and welcome to Fire Headlines, where we cover the hottest topics in fire service news. I'm your host, Samantha Didion, and joining me on the panel today is Chief Jeff Buchanan, Dr. Matt Hinds-Aldrich, and Sara Wood. This week is part 2 of our discussion on outcomes. If you haven't already, tune in to episode 43 to hear part 1. In this episode, we will be discussing a few listener questions that pertain to outcomes in the fire service. The first question I have for our panel is, do you believe there's a direct impact to job satisfaction and overall department morale if firefighters could see they were, quote, moving the needle in regards to community safety and overall outcomes? Sara, what are your thoughts?
I think yes, but also no. And my answer is no if the process didn't identify what the firefighters care about. Because I'm going to say something a little probably controversial. If you sit down and you ask your firefighters, do you want to run less structure fires? Some of you are going to be surprised by that answer. But if you sit down and you're like, hey, do you want to run less structure fires where somebody's injured? They're going to say yes. So if you're measuring outcomes based off of things that firefighters don't care about or necessarily aren't that worried about, but you can show them PowerPoints, you can give them in meetings, you can show them trends. Do they care about the thing that you're showing them? So if you tie it to what they're complaining about, like firefighters, I've been in the fire service about 20 years. And the one thing about us is if there's a problem, we want to solve it and we want to feel like we helped you. But if I go to a call and you didn't need my help, now I've maybe gotten out of bed, I've gotten in the truck, I've gotten, I put on my PPE and I've rolled up to your scene and it's a false alarm. That makes me like, I just wasted my time coming to you. I've just wasted the last half hour, or however long it took me to get ready, get to you, identify the false alarm, handle the system, and then leave. So if you ask your firefighters like, hey, what are your gripes? They're probably going to say things like late night calls at the nursing home, or false alarms, or they're going to say like, I don't like our injury rate. Like it's stressful to have that kind of call where somebody's injured or they have a total loss. So I do feel like outcomes, especially when you tell people what's happening, if they're tied directly to what the firefighters and the personnel care about, I 100% know that it does lead to better job satisfaction. But if you don't, they're not really going to care about it. And you're going to sit there wondering, I did all this research, I did all this analysis on outcomes, and nobody really cares at all. You're going to be sitting there wondering what happened.
Yeah, spot on. And the part that really, I had a bit of a chuckle when I saw this. I was like, well, if you do analysis wrong, you can absolutely make people miserable. And so, in fact, I keep going back to my time in Atlanta. I had lots of great and lots of challenging experiences there. But one of them, when I first got there, I was kind of sort of tasked with sort of taking on and reviving and updating a program we had called AFR STAT, which is Atlanta Fire Rescue STAT, which is kind of like CompStat from the policing world. And they had been doing it for a really long time. And they've been, at that point, they had been doing it for, I think, 8 years or more. So, but the problem is when I got there, I kind of sat down with some of the company officers, some of the battalion chiefs, and just trying to understand, their thoughts on it. And one person's response still to this day cracks me up. He said, "Oh, great, we're going to have a new biweekly beating program." I chuckled, but then I was like, "Wait, is that what it's really referred to as?" He said, because this was something that was done, every 2 weeks. And he's like, "Oh yeah, that's it's well known as the biweekly beatings. We go there and get yelled at for our response times and our turnout times and our travel times." And so the person went on to say that actually got so bad that the battalion chiefs who were scheduled to be on duty on that Tuesday morning would sometimes take their own vacation time to avoid having to go to this session. At that point, it had become so toxic that we had to completely change the mentality of it. And we actually completely turned it into a really effective program. But I do honestly think that the evaluation of programs and measures like this can, to Sara's point, I do think it can be really positive. if you're focused on the right things, and if you're really, sensitive to the unintended consequences, unintended benefits of some of these programs, it can become very adversarial and can be very negative. In fact, it can, in some cases, if done poorly, do more harm than good. So it's definitely a double-edged sword. That said, though, I do think it is valuable and something that can and will and should be done effectively, and really can have an impact on the satisfaction of the firefighters and the company officers, the folks riding backwards, and all the other parts of the organization as well.
Let's talk a bit about what success looks like. What do you guys think is the most practical or realistic way to measure that? We hear a lot about response times being used as a measure of success. So Jeff, what do you think?
It's impractical if you're going to only use response times. It's incredibly impractical because there's so very few municipalities that can achieve such a goal, and there is such a lack of evidence that you can correlate to response times and overall what the successful outcomes are, that I think it just leaves what I'll describe as an incomplete. Yet we look at response times as the sole measure. Specifically when you talk about the breakup of response times, the biggest piece, the travel time, is really where many agencies, I think, spend too much time. And that requires, and what that means is that they spend time adding stations and personnel, dropping more people, adding density. And I'm not saying that that's a mistake. There's many instances when adding more people is surely something that you could do and maybe should do. But the reality is, in many instances, it's unrealistic for a number of different reasons. Financial being one of them. It could be access to good candidates. It could be a number of things. Yet we don't take what's lower hanging fruit and challenge and enhance or improve those areas. For example, on the call processing time, a lot of times the calls will go into a neighboring, a public safety answering point is what's a PSAP, or an emergency call center. And a lot of times fire departments get that call secondarily because it goes into a primary PSAP, which is a police public safety answering point, and then that information gets shipped back to the fire department. If you don't have a free-flowing ability with information, that could cause a disruption in your overall response times if you don't get the call. The arrangement of the units inside of your fire station. For example, if you're coming out of your fire station and let's say you have a 4 or a 5 bay station, and the first rig is, like, let's say for a battalion chief, and the busiest unit is a rescue that's at the far bay, that could take you 15 or 20 seconds to walk across that bay. And changing that arrangement could make a difference. Across the country, when you look at EMS calls versus fire calls, there's a huge discrepancy of turnout times. Generally speaking, medical calls are lower. After midnight, you can close your eyes and put a finger on a map, and you can look at response times or turnout times specifically that are lower after midnight. And so it is I think, identifying some things. I think this goes back to some of the points that Sara made. What can we control and what can't we control? We can't control the distance from A to Z. We can't control unless we add a station or fire personnel. However, we can change signalization strategy. Are you using a GPS or an infrared? GPS is superior because of the technological impediments to infrared. And what I'm talking about there is changing when emergency apparatus approach an intersection, you'll see that the light changes green. The old technology is infrared. The new technology is cloud-based and GPS. And those are ways you can move traffic flow. You can work with your public works to have wider streets, there's different things that you can do. You can work with your local transportation department and you can look at opportunities there. And I guess I'm getting in a little bit of a rabbit hole, but my point where I was going is just focusing on the things that you can change. And I do think in the fire service, we get laser focused on things that we can't change or might not make the biggest difference. And I think that that's a piece of this puzzle too, and just gaining a better understanding of really what we're getting after. And this really, I think, kind of sews together points that both Samantha and Matt were making, is having our arms around where we're going. And I think this gets into some of the questions also, and maybe I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, is why are we doing the things that we're doing, right? And that's an important piece, is to understand that.
Yeah, Jeff, I think you are right on the money. Absolutely. And so for me, when we talk about outcomes, success to me, like as somebody who's like tried to educate people, as somebody who's like carrying this flag for CRR, whenever we're having a discussion about CRR, success to me is, do people understand the process? Can they identify the problem? Like, what is it that they're even trying to do and why it's bad? And then are they sitting down and thoughtfully thinking about tactics? Are they thinking about like, oh, we can't just make people drive faster. Like we can't do that. Like exactly what you're talking about, Jeff. Like we need a new station here, or we need a traffic signaling device, or we need a different door design, one that's like the bifold doors that come out faster. They're thinking about all of those different tactics, identifying which ones we can control, and then putting together that plan of action. And then the last piece is tracking what changed. Like, was the problem improved that we identified? And if you spend a lot of thoughtful time identifying the problem itself and the tactics you're going to use, outcomes are going to be a lot easier because you will have already known in your head how you want that problem to change.
Yeah, and great point, Sarah. One of the questions that I bring up with this is there are certainly, and Jeff already alluded to this earlier, that there are some departments that are really embracing commuter risk reduction. They're taking this mindset. Obviously, the person who wrote this question in is sort of starting to is definitely thinking like that. Problem is what about all the other departments? What about all the ones who they don't like? They're like, why would we bother to even evaluate like traffic signal preemption? Like it's just, I think that's one of the things that I've really focused on quite a bit in the past couple of years. Is it's very easy to take this mentality that if we just kind of focus on and support and, in a sense, lift up the leading departments who are really doing what we like, what we might think of as this kind of mindset change in terms of thinking about service delivery in non-traditional ways and being very thoughtful. Again, there's probably a whole lot of people like, wait, the type of door in your fire station has an impact on your response times. It absolutely does. And actually, I come back to a quote when I was sort of learning about the fire department accreditation model. But the quote was, and I'm going to use a generic thing. So another insurance advisor organization, whose name I won't use, the quote was basically that they measure how many toys you have. Accreditation measures how well you play with those toys. And then the person insightfully noted, nobody measures whether any of it makes a darn bit of difference. That quote for the past 10 years has been in the back of my head. I've spent a lot of time thinking about, what if that is in fact accurate, which I tend to agree, then why is that? Why don't we what becomes the tide that rises all boats? Then how do we actually encourage and incentivize those communities and those fire departments who are not embracing kind of perhaps more modern or more innovative or more service-oriented improvements? How do we actually encourage them to start to think like this and start kind of reevaluating their own organization, their own programs, and their own service delivery? And so, frankly, that's really one of the things that drew me to my current role. So I think I may have mentioned in the previous podcast. So I work for an American Association of Insurance Services, and we're an insurance advisor organization, as I think I mentioned, and we're a not-for-profit organization. But one of the many roles an insurance advisor organization does is evaluating fire protection. And so we're all probably familiar with one of the other entities in this space. But basically, when I got here, it was sort of presented, we have an opportunity to reimagine what evaluating public fire protection looks like. And there was sort of in a sense, carte blanche to say, what actually matters in fire protection? And the insurance industry is starting to asking those questions, and they're starting to ask them in more, thoughtful and more nuanced ways, because what they're seeing is the traditional ways we've measured whether a department is any good or not, that largely focus on response metrics, those don't tend to correlate with economic losses, that don't tend to correlate with claims, or at least there's not a direct correlation as you would expect. And so the insurance industry are starting to how do we do this? And so we're working on new program we have called FLAMES, which stands for Fire Loss and Mitigation Evaluation Score. And again, I don't want to get into a big sales pitch, but what I do want to kind of highlight is that we are really trying to figure out a way of evaluating fire protection in communities, which emergency response is still, is an important part of that. It's always going to be a part of that. If you really talk to like even the most diehard CRR, advocates, of course, they're going to say that we still have to, when someone has an emergency, we still have to get out the door and make whatever their bad situation is better. But one of the things we're doing, and which is really in a sense novel, and we're going to be sharing more about this at the Vision 2020 conference coming up, and then later at the CRR Leadership Conference, is we're developing a way of evaluating whether communities are doing a good job with public fire protection, which includes and really, in a sense, prioritizes community risk reduction. And it's right in the name, the ME in FLAME stands for mitigation evaluation. We are attempting to develop a new way, a new mousetrap, if you will, that really prioritizes and in a sense is going to effectively score communities on whether they're doing a good job in both community risk reduction and fire suppression and fire operations. And so that's one of the things we're doing. We're trying to change a very long legacy of really that we've historically have focused on response time metrics. And again, they're going to always be a part of how we evaluate whether fire departments are effective. But we're trying to develop a new way, and I'm really excited about this. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Jeff.
Thanks, Matt. I love all those points. I just think that this is such a needed conversation, and I know exactly what we're talking about, having gone through that evaluation process with a couple of different organizations, and it does reward, I don't want to say solely, but primarily the amount of toys that you do have. First of all, it's an unfair assessment for many different reasons, and it really comes down to, it does dive into the science. Is there a causal relationship to that amount of apparatus or whatever it is, and whatever outcome it is that you're tying to, and simply put, is it effective? And we, we have to take the time to evaluate that and research that first in order to see if that is the mechanism that drives that result. And it hasn't been done. I definitely have a couple theories on that, and maybe that's a different episode, but just to toss it out there broadly, and it may seem like it's not involved, but it is. Economics are involved here. There's certainly economics involved here, and there's vested interests that's here. And I just don't think any of us can deny the amount of influence that economics places in these types of arenas. Now, we're never going to get away from it. It's fool's gold. It's naive to think that economics aren't going to play a role in decision making. It's clear. It's a direct relationship, but we also have to, I think, appropriately weigh the influence as we're going through the exploration and in a situation like this. So I really like those points that you brought up, Matt. I'm with you 100%.
The final question I have is, what is the best feedback loop or mechanism for the firefighters going on the calls to then see the overall result? Matt, what comes to mind for you?
Great question. And in fact, I'll go back to AFR stat. Another key learning I had when I first got there and first took over the AFR stat was from another battalion chief who kind of, again, had a relatively negative view of the way it had been done in the past. But he also insightfully said, he's like, I get it. We have skeletons in our closet. Operations, there are things we definitely need to improve. There's definitely service delivery enhancements we can make, and we should be doing those, and we should be talking about those. But he then went on to say, but why is it only operations that we look at? He's like, yeah, certainly we got skeletons in our closet, but he's like, so does everyone else around here. He joked, he said, I would really like to see the payroll manager up there with AFR stat scorecards defending how many payroll errors occurred in the past quarter. He's like, I'm willing to be accountable for what my operations folks have done and really to talk about how we're trying to improve service delivery. But he said the thing that really would change our organization and make this actually effective is actually thinking about data and stats beyond operations. And so it's not just about response times and turnout times, but everything else in the organization. And that's what we did. Is we actually created performance metrics, and we worked with all the company officers and the other managers across the entire organization, everything from hiring and recruitment to HR functions and inspections, even and this is definitely a story for another day, but even our chaplain had performance measures. But again, the whole idea was to identify opportunities to improve the entire organization. And that is what actually I find that gets a lot of the operations folks interested is seeing the problems and the frustrations that they have being fixed, or if nothing else, being exposed. And so that way it's not just that they're the kind of the center of attention or the center of kind of focus, but that they're a key part of a wider organizational focus on improvement.
Matt, I love that you talk about Atlanta because my experience is actually on the opposite spectrum. And I spent most of my time, like the last 20 years, in very small rural volunteer and combination departments who are considerably less people in them. And even at that level of scale, what I would say is there's a communication problem all the way down the line. Like even in meetings where the chief and the assistant chief are talking about programs with like the captain, that information never made it all the way down because the people who are in the room are officer level and above. And just saying, like holding space to say, hey, everybody needs to hear this message. Like, do they have a mechanism at all for receiving information? Like, are you sending out a newsletter? Are you having a 15-minute meeting, or are you doing anything as a total group? And I will say where I did have experience of this kind of information getting all the way down the line is not even with the fire service. It's with a tech company that I worked for a while named My Sidewalk, where every Friday we would have demos and everybody got the same message. And they were presented with, hey, this is a client that we helped. This is the outcome from that client. Here's kind of like a white paper. Here's this new feature we built. Here's why it matters. And everybody was seeing how all of their work fit together into a larger picture. And I'm not saying nobody in the fire service does it. I'm saying I have not seen a fire department do a really good all hands meeting to tell them these important messages. And maybe it is happening. If you're a listener and that's happening for you, I want you to share it and show like how you're able to get all of that stuff down, because right now I just don't see communication all the way down to the boots on the ground. And they're the ones that we need hearing it the most.
I think that is a great point to end on. And like Sara just said, if you have a useful method for getting communication all the way down the line, then share it with us at fireheadlines@wfca.com. Thank you to our panel for joining us today, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you'd like to get in contact with one of our guest panelists, check out the show notes for this episode. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and follow us on social media. We'll see you back here next week for more Fire Headlines.